Welcome back, guys, for part 3 of how to paint Gunpla using spray cans. So all the painting is now done. We covered that in part 2, and now our custom model is all done, right? No, not yet. So in keeping the series very beginner orientated, we're not getting into too much customization or weathering and advanced techniques like that, but we are going to still be covering some of the basics. As far as finishing techniques go, that will include panel lining, decals, and top coating that we're going to cover in this third and final part of the series. We are going to be going in that order. That said, panel lining and decals could be switched, just kind of depends on your preference, but for the purposes of this video, I think the more beginner-friendly order would be doing our panel lining first and then the decals. So we'll get into that first. And just a reminder as we get into it, guys, in the course of learning these techniques, or even later on after you've already learned, you will make mistakes. So you can't be afraid to make mistakes with some of these. You just kind of have to try it. Most of the mistakes that you're going to make with these stages can very easily be fixed, and learning how to fix your mistakes is an important part of learning or growing your skills as a modeler anyway. So it's very important to be able to learn how to fix the mistakes when things do inevitably go wrong. So let's get to panel lining our model. And you may have heard before that you need to gloss coat before you do your panel lining and decals, and that's kind of only partly true. Because again, there's really no hard and set rules for doing anything in this hobby, but as it goes with panel lining, and then it also goes for decals as well, having a nice glossy surface that you would get from a gloss coat is helpful for, in the case of panel lining, for your panel lining medium to flow into where it needs to go easily on that smooth surface, or in the case of decals, having a smooth surface for your decal to adhere to smoothly as well. So fortunately, many lacquer paints are already glossy by nature as soon as you spray them on. So if that's the case, that you're using a glossy type paint, you don't really necessarily need to use a gloss coat before you do your panel lining and decals. It becomes much less necessary, but it's still a good idea to do it anyway. In the case for our model here today, all of the paints that I used were either gloss or semi-gloss, except for the dark yellow color was the only of the paints that I used for this that has a flat finish to it, which was only a couple of parts, so I'm gonna get by just fine without gloss coating. That said, if you do want to or need to gloss coat, you can refer back to the steps in part 2 where we talk about painting, because the steps for gloss coating or matte coating or anything is going to be the same as painting. It's basically just applying a clear paint to the kit. Now, there are many ways to do panel lining on a kit, and some of the techniques depend on whether you're talking about panel lining on a painted model or an unpainted model. Probably the most common and the most beginner-friendly way to do panel lining on a kit that's painted with lacquer paints would be using the Tamiya Panel Line Accent Color series. These are available in a bunch of different colors: black, light brown, dark brown, gray, white, purple, flesh tone. I think there's a bunch of different ones. So just like you can consider the color of the surfacer before you paint, you can also consider the color of the panel lining color that you're going to be applying after the paint, so that your panel line color also helps to accent or accentuate the details and the color that matches well with the color that we used for painting the parts. Because while black is quite commonly used, you shouldn't only rely on doing black for all of your panel lining. You should consider what color works best for the color of your paint. So for example, on white or light gray colored parts, you may want to use gray panel liner. On reds, yellows, orange, kind of warm colored parts, you may want to use brown panel liner. And on parts that are like blue, green, purple, a little bit darker colors, then in that case, black is usually what would work best. But just remember that the reason that we panel line is to simulate either a shadow and or like dirt or material that is in between the panels of the armor and details for a kit. So using like a pink panel liner on a white parts wouldn't really make sense. What would be the reason for that, to either the shadow or dirt or whatever to appear pink inside the panel lines? Now, that said, you can absolutely do that as a way of making the kit look more stylistic. Or for example, if you were painting a robot to make it look like it's been operating on Mars, for example, you may want to use a more kind of reddish color in your panel lining to simulate the look of that red dust being stuck in the panels and things like that. So really any color can be used for your panel lining. And if you want the greatest freedom over your color range when you're doing your panel lining, the best way to do it would be to use a thinned down enamel paint. So you can use any particular color that you can get in enamel paint, or you can mix colors. You can make your own panel lining fluid just by thinning it down a bit more, and you're just going to apply it in the same way as you would that we're going to here today using the Tamiya Panel Line Accent Colors. So after making sure to shake your accent color well to get all of the pigment that's settled down at the bottom all stirred in, you're just going to simply use the included applicator brush on the underside of the cap to just either dot it or paint it along any panel lines or recessed details that you have around in the kit. You don't need to be super precise, because part of the process will be cleaning up the excesses later on. On our particular kit, we don't have a ton of details that need to be panel lined on this one, so there's not going to really be a whole lot that we need to do for this one. So in this case, it won't take you much time, but if you're working on something larger like a master grade that has a lot of details on it, you are going to want to set aside a bit more time to be able to do all your panel lining. Now, warning time. Another thing you probably have heard about panel lining is that it can weaken or damage or break your plastic parts. Now, that absolutely is true in theory, although how common that actually is really just kind of depends on how careful you are. So what actually is happening there is that in the panel line accent color, or in a lot of materials that are used for panel lining, there's solvent in a lot of paints that are used. So anything that has solvent in it, that solvent is going to damage the plastic. It can weaken the plastic. It can lead to the plastic breaking, in particular ABS plastic. So that's why you want to be particularly careful with ABS plastic. Now that said, the great thing about solvent is that it evaporates quite quickly. So as you're putting it on, it's really not having enough time to really do enough damage to the parts. But what can cause that solvent to do damage to your parts and weaken them and potentially break them is if you're pooling the paint on there too much, your accent color in this case, pooling too much of it on there that it doesn't have enough time to evaporate quickly, or if it's getting in and underneath some different parts. So if you have like an enclosed part and you put a bunch of panel line liquid on there and it goes inside the part where it's not kind of free to evaporate quickly out into the air, and it's just sitting inside there, when that solvent is just sitting inside the part, that's when it's eating away at the plastic and it can eventually crack or break. So now we're done, we're ready to clean up our mess. What do we do next? We actually have to just take a minute to just wait, and the reason for this is because if you go to clean up the excesses too quickly, what'll happen is that you'll end up just kind of smearing it and making a mess. The paint hasn't had enough time to dry. You want the paint to be dry, but on the opposite side, you don't want the paint to be totally cured. So if you wait too long, the paint is more cured, it's harder to clean up, and it'll be more of a chore to try to get the excesses of your panel line color cleaned up. You might actually end up damaging the paint in the process, and so you don't want to do that. I find that under normal conditions, usually waiting about 30 minutes to an hour is a good length of time before you start cleaning up. And normally by the time you start and then you go through and doing all your panel lining on all the parts, by the time you get to the end, it's probably been at least 30 minutes since when you started. So by the time you're finished with all the parts, you can kind of go back to where you started and start doing your cleanup. If you have the time, you may want to just give it just a little bit more time to dry, but like I said, you don't want to wait too long. Leaving it even just 24 hours overnight is usually kind of long. You're going to have a harder time cleaning it up the next day. So in theory, you would ideally like to be able to do all your panel lining and clean up in one day, in one sitting. You probably don't want to leave it on there overnight if you still have some more to clean up. Now, just like there are many methods for the medium that you use and how you apply it onto the kit, there's a lot of different ways to clean up the excesses of your panel lining. But what I find is the easiest and why I would recommend to you guys as a very beginner-friendly way is actually just to use lighter fluid. So you can just get lighter fluid. It's cheap, very easily, readily available. You should be able to get it no matter where you live. And cotton swabs or Q-tips, whatever you want to call them. So what you're going to want to do is just dampen the cotton with the lighter fluid, not soak it. So if there's too much on there, just kind of dab it on a paper towel or something just to make sure that it's not completely soaked with lighter fluid. And then you're going to simply just gently rub away any excesses that you have of the panel lining liquid where it's not supposed to be, and it should work very simply and easily. If you do end up removing too much, you can simply just reapply the panel lining fluid and then just kind of wait and then just repeat the process again. And that's pretty much it. Our panel lining is done. Very simple, very easy. And now we can just move on to decals. So there are, of course, 3 main types of decals that are commonly used with Gunpla. They would be sticker decals, dry transfer decals, and water slide decals. Now, sticker decals look fine on unpainted kits. On painted kits, they're not really worth the trouble. They don't really look very good, and while they're easy to apply, they're not going to look the best, so I would just not really recommend using sticker decals if you're going to be painting your kits. Dry transfer decals can look really good when they're applied well, but they're really not that common, especially in modern kits. In older kits, they used to include dry transfer decals a lot more. I kind of find them kind of tricky to put on, so I don't really like using them. What is most common and what, in my opinion, are the easiest to get the best looking results would be water slide decals. So that's what we're going to be focusing on for today's video. Now, just like with the paint and with the panel lining, there's things to consider when it comes to your decals. If you're not working with a specific set of decals for your specific kit, in that case, if you're doing custom decals, as it were, you need to consider both the color of the decals and also the scale of the decals. As for the color, you need to consider what is going to be easy to see. For example, if you're using gray decals on a blue part, you're probably not going to be able to see the decal very well, in which case you absolutely could do that, again, for stylistic purposes, but in most cases, you're probably not going to want to do that. You also need to consider the color of the decal as an accent color to the rest of the colors that you have on the kit. So that's why you end up seeing a lot of white, red, and orange being some of the most common accent colors used for decals to kits, just because they're very universally appealing and kind of go together with almost any other color scheme that you have for your main color scheme for your kit. And then as for the scale of the decals, the scale doesn't necessarily have to match the scale of the kit. So if, say, for example, you're using a 1/100 scale kit, you don't necessarily have to use 1/100 scale decals. In some cases, using 1/144 scale decals will be smaller, but they may actually look more size appropriate considering the subject material. And you also need to consider how heavy or light you plan on going with the decals. If you want to have a lot of markings, a lot of decals on a kit, especially again on a 1/100 scale kit, if you're using 1/100 scale decals, they'll be larger, and if you use a lot of them, it'll cover a lot more of the surface with decals. You may not want to do that. Using 1/44 scale decals will allow you to use more decals on the kit, but they won't necessarily be taking up a ton of surface space. Personally, when it comes to applying the decals, I like to start with the large markings first, would be like a large logo or marking or number or something like that, because it kind of sets the tone for the rest of the decals and also ensures that you have enough space for those, because if you do all your small ones first, then you want to apply your big one, you may realize that in the space that you need for this big decal or this big logo, you've already put, 1 or 2 smaller decals there. So I would recommend starting with the big, large markings and logos first, and then doing all your small caution markings. Most waterslide decals are already pre-cut, which means that the decal is already separated from the paper and has a very minimal border around it. So you can actually just cut the paper around the decal, either as close or as far away from the decal as you'd like. It really doesn't matter. I use a hobby knife to cut out around the decal and then dip it in water for a few seconds to make sure the paper is soaked. And then I just set it down onto a cutting mat, because the decal won't immediately be ready to come off of the paper that it's on. It takes a few minutes to soak. And so because of this, I'll usually cut out and prepare a few decals at a time. But again, it's kind of about finding a balance, because if you cut out a whole bunch of decals and then have them all wet and sitting there, some of them, by the time you actually get to applying them on, because it takes some time to actually put them on, some of them will end up drying out while they're just sitting there, and then you have to dip it in there again. And so usually I have about 4 to 10 decals going at a time, where basically I'll cut, dip, set it down, cut, dip, set it down, cut, dip, set it down, and then apply, 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 and then repeat the whole process again. As far as applying the decal, here's where I think a lot of people run into trouble, and also where I do things a little bit differently. So this just goes to the point where it's important to learn techniques, but then also just find what works for you, because the way that you learned may not best necessarily be the way that you just find works the easiest or works the best for how you like to make your models. Again, we have some products we're going to use here at this point. There are 2 commonly used products when applying waterslide decals. You have your Mr. Mark Softer or Mr. Mark Setter. These are the Mr. Hobby options. There are other different options available from different companies that are all going to do the same thing essentially, but the Mr. Mark Softer will essentially melt the decal and help it to form around curved surfaces, uneven surfaces. If you want to shape the decal around a hard edge, or sink the decal down into a panel lining, so if your decal is going over an area where there's a panel lining running through it, the Mr. Mark Softer will help to melt the decal so that it falls down into the panel line. And then Mark Setter is essentially just a glue that just helps the decal to adhere better to the surface. Personally, I rarely ever use Mr. Mark Setter, just because I find the adhesive that's already on the decal itself is usually enough to help the decal to stick to the part, that you usually don't need to use an additional product in order to keep the decal adhered to the part. But the other important thing to note about these products is that they can be applied onto the part either before you stick the decal onto or after, so it really doesn't matter the order. But for me, what I like to do is put a drop of Mr. Mark Softer on the part first, where I'm going to be placing the decal. Now conventionally what you do to apply the decal to the part is you use a damp with water Q-tip, and now again, not soaking wet, but just damp with water, and just you're gonna slide, that's what they're called, water slides, slide the decal from the paper onto the part. I personally find this very uncomfortable, and I have a really hard time doing that because you have to hold the part in a certain way or set the part down, and if it's kind of an uneven surface or on like the side of a part, it's just really kind of uncomfortable for me. So what I will actually do is hold the paper gently in my fingers and gently slide the decal to the edge of the paper, pick it up with the tweezers, and then gently place it onto the part. And then you can adjust the placement of the decal using the tweezers as well, just again, being very careful with it. If you find there's too much water and the decal is just kind of sliding around all over the place, you can touch the Q-tip to there to just soak up a little bit of the water. And then once you have it in the right place, you're then just going to gently press it down with the Q-tip. You can also then roll the Q-tip, but you want to make sure it's pressed down first before you roll it. If you go to roll it without pressing it down, you'll probably just move the decal and it'll end up being in the wrong spot. Now, using a combination of pressing and rolling the decal will just help to ensure there's no bubbles underneath the decal. And this goes back to why it's important to having a glossy surface under your decals, because you're going to want a nice, smooth, flat surface for the decal to go down on. If there's any air bubbles or any space in between the actual part, your paint, and the decal itself, once you go to top coat it, that's when you're going to get what we call decal silvering, where you have a visible layer or bubbles that look kind of like silver underneath the decal and just ends up looking bad. So it's really just all about being gentle and about being patient in particular, because especially if you're doing custom decals, you can end up spending a lot of time, hours, just looking at the decals, looking at the parts, going back and forth, trying to decide which is the right decal exactly for this part on the kit. And it can end up taking a lot of time. And in this video, I won't get into the methodology of decal placement, but basically just look at other different examples. If you're doing, again, custom decals, look at examples, just kind of based on what you've seen, you can kind of should be able to tell what kind of decals will look good where, and it's really just kind of all up to you anyway. Now again, just a word of warning, guys, while you're handling the parts, while you're putting a decal on one side of the part, you may not notice that you're also touching where you just put a decal on a different side of the part. So just make sure that you're handling the parts carefully, and because if you are touching a decal that you just put on there, you may end up inadvertently taking the decal off, and then you'll turn the part around and say, hey, where'd that decal go that I just put on there? And it's now stuck on your finger or somewhere else gone entirely. Again, mistakes will happen. So if it's your first time ever working with waterslide decals, one thing you might want to do is just practice with some extra decals or with some decals that you know you're not going to use, some extra little bits. Practice applying them onto just some spare parts, just so you can get the hang of how you're going to be making the decal wet, putting it onto the part, making sure it's pressed down and stuck on there. It's a really pretty simple process, but a little bit of practice will help to boost your confidence when you go to actually put them onto your kit for the first time. So, all right, guys, we're almost there. The panel lighting's done, the decals are done, and we're ready to top coat this thing, put the final cherry on top, and be done with this kit. Top coating is essentially just spraying a clear paint onto the kit. So in order for how to spray it, just again, refer back to video part 2 where we talked about how to use a spray can to paint the parts, because you're going to want to do it in the exact same way, holding the part so far away from the spray can, spraying carefully, making sure the paint is not going to pool, etc. Now with top coat, you have a choice between glossy, semi-gloss, or matte or flat finish. One common question that I get a lot is how much of the kit should you assemble or disassemble when you go to do your final top coat? And it really kind of just depends on what you're planning on doing with the kit once it's all done. If you're planning on keeping the kit in one static pose and not ever changing the pose again, you could, in theory, just put it all together and have it in your one pose, and then just spray your top coat over the top of it and you'd be done. And that's really kind of the most economical way to do it too, because you're going to end up using the least amount of top coat. So if you really want to make your can of top coat last the longest, you could do it that way. That said, if you are planning on moving the kit around and you're planning on doing different poses and things with it, if you sprayed it all at once you go to then move the parts, you're going to notice that then you're exposing a part that maybe didn't get top coated, and so you're going to have, it's going to be looking kind of weird. You'll have everything like a matte finish, for example, and then you have like your knee joint, which is now exposed with like a glossy finish or whatever was the finish of the paint that you used for that part. So with that in mind, for me, typically I don't do a lot of posing after I have the kit painted, but I'll break the kit down into sections. So I'll have like an arm, a leg, a torso, a head, a backpack, a weapon, for example, and I'll just top coat these sections at a time. And again, a final warning reminder for you guys to consider the weather when you're doing your top coating, especially if you're doing it outside and where it's not climate controlled. If it's particularly humid or particularly cold, it will absolutely mess with your top coat. And after you've done all the work that you've put into the kit, you really don't want to have your top coat mess up and like look foggy or just generally ruin the kit. And another warning reminder for you guys is to also consider any clear parts that are in the kit. Any clear parts, if you're planning on using a matte or a flat finish top coat, it's going to fog those clear parts. So you either need to remove those clear parts out before you spray your top coat, or you need to cover them either by masking tape or putty or whatever. Make sure those clear parts are covered so you're not spraying them with matte coat. If you're spraying a gloss or even a semi-gloss, probably not going to matter too much. But the same thing also goes for any foil stickers. So for example, if you use the foil stickers for your cameras on like the Gundam's head camera or something like that, a matte finish will absolutely, it won't ruin it, but it will definitely change the look of that foil sticker. So that may be something that if you're planning on using, you may just want to leave that sticker off until the kit's completely done and then just put that on at the very end. So as it goes with painting, once the top coat is applied, you probably want to wait a good at least 30 minutes before handling the parts, maybe even a little bit more if you have the time, because you would really, again, hate to mess anything up, hate to make fingerprints in your top coat or something like that at this stage. So wait before putting the kit together. And at last, you're finally ready to assemble the kit and see the fruit of all your hard labor. Again, a reminder that some of the parts may be a little tight to put together. Now, if you didn't mask or in any other way cover the joint, for example, the pegs on a parts, if you didn't mask those parts through either the painting or top coating, you may find that the layers of paint and or top coat that you have on there have now made some of the pegs and some of the connections a little bit tight. So just remember, don't force anything. If you do find pegs that are just really tight and not fitting in, go back and either with just like a little sanding stick or your knife or something, just kind of score some of the paint off the peg there a little bit, and then that should give you a perfect fit. So congratulations guys on your custom painted Gunpla. In this series, we covered some of the most basic steps, and there's a lot of different ways to do these steps, and there's of course a lot more basic steps. I mean, there's a lot more intermediate and advanced steps that we could get into, and even at just the basic level, there's a lot of different steps and techniques that you can do for a lot of this different stuff. And I've done other videos in the past talking about some of these different techniques, and we'll do of course more in the future. If you want to see some more, you can check out the tutorials playlist here on my channel. Some of those videos are in that playlist that you might find useful. And as always, if you have questions about anything you've seen in these videos, you can leave your questions down in the comment section below. And if you guys have any suggestions for future tutorials or future techniques that you would like to see covered here on the channel, you can let me know either in the comments or via private message about those as well. And while spray can painting is great for beginners, and as I said at the start of this series, it's a great way to just kind of get your feet wet, to try out kind of the steps of painting, I wouldn't recommend sticking with spray cans for too long, just because the cost of them does add up quite quickly, and airbrushing just gives you so much more control and gives you so much more options when it comes to painting your kits. So airbrushing is absolutely the way that I would recommend to go. If you've already been using spray cans to paint a couple of kits and you have that experience under your belt, and if you have the means and the space available to try out airbrushing, I would absolutely recommend getting into airbrushing, and that's what we're going to be covering in the next video series. We're going to be doing it like this video series. It's just going to be a couple of parts. I'm going to be telling you guys how to go about from start to finish painting a custom Gunpla using an airbrush, and so there will be obviously some different techniques and important things to know when it comes to airbrushing a kit. Most of the process will generally be the same, but we will get into a little bit more sort of, I would say, the intermediate stages, I guess, of custom Gunpla modeling in that next video series, so stay tuned for that. As always guys, if you want to check out some models, paints, tools, supplies, and everything else, you can check the link in the video description to USA Gundam Store. Got all sorts of stuff there on the website. And as always guys, if you enjoyed the video, if you enjoyed the series, leave a like, make sure that you're subscribed. I really appreciate all your guys' support. Thank you so much. I'm sorry that this final video took so long. For the next airbrush series, I'll try to get those out more quickly. But as always guys, thank you so much for all of your support. Until next time, see you later.